thank you all for taking an interest in today. It's great to see students thinking about antimicrobial resistance, and particularly on a Saturday. I'm Bryan Deane. I work for the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. A long time ago I did a PhD in neuropathology and then joined the industry, and I've spent a lot of time in different therapy areas, but including antibacterials. I'd be quite happy if this is interactive, so if you've got questions as I go along, shout, but otherwise I'm aiming to leave a decent amount of time at the end for questions if there are any. So just dividing the talk into 4 sections, a bit about the ABPI and a bit about the industry itself, and how we go about discovering and developing new medicines. A little bit more about the issue of AMR, which was touched on earlier. Some of the initiatives that have been put in place and that are going on and recent progress, and then a little bit about looking ahead. Okay, so the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry represents innovative research-based industry. We have large, medium and small members. There's a lot of volatility in the industry over the years. There are some very big companies. There have been a large number of mergers over the last 25 years, but there's a vibrant proportion of new companies, small companies, spin-outs, biotech companies. So there's a whole range of sizes of companies that we represent, and we supply in the UK more than 80% of all branded medicines to the NHS. And we're recognised by government as the industry body, or one of the industry bodies, negotiating on behalf of our member companies. So when there are common pieces of policy to make things work better in the UK, we bring those together and speak to government about changing policy and amending policy. So that's really who we are and what we try and do. A little bit about the fact that developing new medicines obviously is a global undertaking these days. Trials are done throughout the world in all countries, and companies are present in all countries. So obviously there's a lot of companies that do this work over the years in the US, a large number around Europe, quite a few in Japan as well, and more in China and even India. So there are at the moment about 7,000 medicines in development at the various phases, from preclinical into early clinical development, and then phase 2 and phase 3. And they cut across all sorts of therapy areas. The focus on therapy areas varies from time to time as sort of successes are achieved, and I'll come back to this. Then companies sort of move on to more challenging areas, and obviously the whole understanding of immunology and oncology these days is a very high focus. So you'll see that a large proportion, 1,800 of these 7,000 entities in development, are in oncology at the moment. So what's the process? So the process for developing, and there's a lot of always been a lot of collaboration between industry researchers and academic researchers and clinicians, and it's that discussion between those three that really leads to the possibilities of identifying new targets in cells and enzymes for developing medicines to affect the process of disease. So the first area, once you've thought about the target, is to look at the design of an intervention that would affect that target that might then interfere with the disease process, maybe even stop the disease process. And so you've got the lead discovery, and it's that point that we may have to look at a lot of different options before we find something that looks as if it'll work. And medicinal chemistry then comes into play, where we modify molecules. Traditionally, small molecules are relatively straightforward chemically to modify, but biological molecules, antibodies, are a little bit more tricky to actively fiddle with the synthesis. And then we tend to do in vitro studies, maybe in vivo studies, to look at how the potential new medicine will interact with the enzymes or whatever it is in the target, how it might work in vitro in a cell culture, how it might work in the body, and then we would move into, once we're happy that a molecule is safe enough and looks as if it would have some efficacy, then we would move into first time in man, and that's always been done very, very cautiously, with very low doses to begin with in small numbers, and then gradually building up to safeguard the safety of patients. And then we get into the full-blown phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, which are designed specifically to show the degree of efficacy and then the efficacy safety balance, which obviously is critically important, and in life-threatening diseases there tends to be a slightly different balance in terms of accepting a degree of adverse events as a trade-off for having some efficacy in saving life. But as we move forward, more and more we're looking at measuring quality of life in patients and looking for that extended life having a good quality and not just a few months of being saved on rather toxic products. So things are moving all the time, and oncology, as I said, is a particularly high focus at the moment. So if we look across that process, it's a long and risky road. There's a huge amount of investment needs to go in, and there are a lot of failures. So it's quite often, traditionally, we've had to investigate 5,000 to 10,000 compounds with those modifications in medicinal chemistry and such like to actually achieve 1 or 2 approvals to take into general clinical use at the end of it. So and it takes about 12 years on average. So that's split between drug discovery and preclinical, the first 3 to 6 years. The clinical trial program, as I said, phase 1 clinical pharmacology, phase 2 when you're looking for early efficacy in small numbers, and then the scale up to show significant clinical benefit in the phase 3 studies, 6 to 7 years, and then all that data is put together along with the safety data, the manufacturing data, submitted to the regulator, the FDA in the US, EMA in the EU, and MHRA in the UK, which we hope will remain at least aligned with the EMA regardless of what happens in terms of leaving the EU. On average, the industry invests over £1.2 billion for every successfully approved new medicine. That accounts for the amount we have to put into all those phases and includes all the failures. So in UK, we attract about £5 billion worth per year of that investment. And one of the things that on behalf of working with the UK government in the life sciences industrial strategy that has been in place for a couple of years now is making sure that the UK remains an attractive place for global companies to do this work. We have a very high reputation obviously for scientific research and for medical research, and a pretty good reputation for the clinical piece of this, but companies can do this work wherever it's easy, wherever you can get the right patients, wherever you can get things moving efficiently, and we want to make sure the UK is a great place to do all this work in the future. And at the moment we employ about 61,000 people across R&D and manufacturing in the UK. So just to sort of look at that cost versus how we make our money, looking at the 12 years we talked about before launch, it's all investment, it's all work in the labs, work in clinical trials, work towards the regulatory process, and once we get the product launched, then we'll get some degree of sales growth, usually in the traditional model under patent protection, and that gives us usually about 10 to 12 years patent protection, usually at some level of premium price because we've shown significant clinical benefit in the trials. And then after the patent expiry, generic companies can all come in and the price tends to drop, which is good for patients and for the health service. So once you've had that 10 years experience, you've got some very good generic drugs which form the basis for treating a lot of patients, and the reduced prices also give you the opportunity to spend a bit more on the new stuff that's then coming through. So let's turn our attention now to antibiotics, which is the topic of the day. So there are 5 most widely used classes of antibiotics: penicillins, aminoglycosides, macrolides, quinolones and cephalosporins, many of which were already in place, approved and in use by the mid-1960s. So that period from when Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928 to the point in the early 1940s when people decided it'd be a very good idea if we had enough penicillin to treat all the nasty infections that were being incurred by war injuries, which really drove the initiation of the modern industry as we know it, because it was quite difficult to scale up production of penicillin, as in fact it is a biological. And a lot of the companies that started to get involved were basically chemical companies whose challenge was to successfully scale up that manufacture. So that's where a lot of the industry started. And even when Fleming was awarded the Nobel Prize, he pointed out that if you undertreated, you could select resistant strains to penicillin right in those early days between about 1930 and 1940 when they were still researching it. So we've known that bacteria evolve. There are countable numbers of genetic mutations that happen in bacterial populations all the time, and if you apply selective pressure with a subclinical dose of antibiotics, you will select out the resistant populations. So that, as a principle, has been known all the way through this story. And so if you do treat successfully with a proper clinical dose, and if you can eradicate the bacteria, as was alluded to earlier, from the human body when it's a pathogen, then you won't obviously be able to finish up with resistant pathogens. You have different effects on the microbiome, and I'll come back to that. So as I said, the modern pharmaceutical industry really built off that initial challenge to upscale the manufacture of penicillins. And this is a list. I won't read through it, but these are some of the advances that were made from the 1950s and 60s through hypertension, asthma, ulcers, depression, and the advent of HIV and AIDS, migraine, emesis, lipid lowering, and so on. Every one of these medicines was launched, registered and launched as a branded medicine, and went through that process of being successful and then genericized. So most of these generic names would be household names to you as you do your training and learn to treat in different therapy areas, and all of them remain very good and effective drugs as generics. So that, as I said earlier, the majority of prescriptions in the NHS and in every other country are really for these very standard effective generic drugs. The same really is true of all those antibiotic classes that we mentioned. And I'll come back to the range of classes, but basically by the time we got to the 1970s and 1980s, we had a whole range of very good antibiotics that were generic. So amoxicillin, ciprofloxacin, some of the macrolides as the most common ones, all very good and very effective for most primary care infections. And if it wasn't for resistance, that would be the story, and we wouldn't be worried, and we wouldn't be here today. So the genericization of very good products is standard across the industry, and there are a lot of good antibiotics. But the issue, as you know, we're going to talk about now a little bit more. So mortality rates and life expectancy, since 1900, a combination of vaccines, prevention of infection and treatment, effective treatment, has brought mortality down, particularly due to infectious diseases, the red line. And that's very good for us all. The risk, of course, is that reduction in mortality includes the ability to do surgery, even to do transplants, to treat immunocompromised patients in hospitals. And all of that type of modern medicine is protected by the ability to treat infections. And if those infections become resistant, that's the real challenge. So why that's building up a little bit to saying why infectious disease is a bit different. So when we're considering prescribing an antibiotic, we need to consider both treating the patient in front of you, that's eradicating the pathogen, getting that patient better, but also minimizing the effect on the patient's microbiome and the potential for selecting out resistant organisms in that area as well. And that both the aim of not leaving the patient with resistant pathogens and not creating more resistance in the microbiome is part of the consideration of the potential impact on the rest of the population, which needs to be considered. So in primary care, we're generally treating otherwise healthy patients, usually fairly common pathogens, particularly Streptococcus haemophilus in respiratory tract infections. In secondary care, we're more looking at more seriously ill patients, and we're dealing with a lot of these opportunistic pathogens that were mentioned earlier, particularly Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, that sort of thing. And they're not normally pathogenic in very healthy people. So there's a difference in that balance that was also alluded to between how the body is dealing with these potential pathogens and how the antibiotics can help get rid of them. So we're very much in favor of supporting appropriate prescribing, the right patient receiving the right medicine at the right dosage, the right formulation at the right time, the right duration, for the right indication, which means picking the pathogen or the most likely pathogen and the infection site. And if we can apply appropriate prescribing, that is that the patient who needs the antibiotic gets it and the patients who don't need it don't get it, then we're minimizing the risk of future resistance. And so the guidelines really probably are in primary care, use only if it's bacterial, and that's likely to be clinically likely. You're not going to get bacterial confirmation, or one tends not to do those tests in every patient that's suspected of having a bacterial infection in primary care. It'd be great if we had an on-site test that you could confirm bacterial infections very quickly, because then you wouldn't have parents demanding antibiotics for their ill kids. You'd be able to say, absolutely, that's not bacterial, so we're not going to give you one. So obviously avoid using if the pathogen's viral, and that will minimize further resistance. In secondary care, again, use only if it's likely to be bacterial. Often if they're seriously ill patients, you'll start with a combination, but you'll have taken a sample and you'll expect to get bacteriological confirmation and the likely antibiotics that will succeed. And it's in this area particularly that we need new antibiotics to combat those resistant infections, because the multi-resistant infections are causing most problems in the secondary care setting. Now, if we come up with new antibiotics, particularly, those antibiotics should come attached with very clear appropriate use and stewardship guidelines. and that obviously to preserve their efficacy. If we can find new antibiotics that will treat these resistant infections, we really do need to look after them for the future. Gram-positive or gram-negative, just the split and the list and the traditional way of classifying those, which is primarily to do with staining in the microscope, and the slight difference is the cell wall, which also has an impact on whether you can treat them or not and which mechanism of treatment. And these are the different classes of antibiotics that have been developed and were pretty well all in place by about 1990. So the 5 common ones that I mentioned, plus a load of other ones. The slides will be available, so I'm not going to read through this, it's pretty busy. But one other point to note is that some of the antibiotics and some of the classes indeed are bactericidal, which means they actually kill the bacteria. Some of them are only bacteriostatic, so they stop the infection growing and spreading, which means you must have good host defenses to work with the antibiotic in those cases. But as was mentioned, those have all been with us since about 1990. And it's at that point that they're mostly becoming generic, and the industry is looking at bacterial infections and thinking this is not an area that is high unmet need anymore, and so the investment tended to reduce at that point. So let's look at the mechanisms of action. Bacteria, I suppose, relatively simple cells. There are only half a dozen mechanisms of action of the antibiotics, and they do vary a little bit depending on which bacterium you're looking at. The beta-lactams, clearly the traditional cell wall attack, and then some of the others, such as the tetracyclines, aminoglycosides, are attacking the protein synthesis mechanism. So you're looking for, and we found, even before we could understand some of these, the mechanisms which will prevent the bacteria from being viable, but because the bacteria are different from our own cells, that you will get that selective toxicity, and they're pretty non-toxic, most of the antibiotics. And then there's, obviously, for the same reason, there's about half a dozen resistance mechanisms. So bacteria seem to be pretty clever. 1 or 2 of them manage to do more than one of these mechanisms. So you've got an efflux pump that pumps the antibiotic out of the cell. You've got enzymes either on the surface or inside the bacterium which they can develop, which will break down the antibiotic, so like beta-lactamases. They can fairly quickly sort of shore up the walls and stop the antibiotics getting in. They can actually alter the targets if it's enzymes inside the cell, so that the target doesn't look like it used to the antibiotic, and it won't have any effect on it. And in some cases it can bypass the metabolic pathway that you were attacking, and therefore not need the one that the antibiotic works against. So that's about it, really. Those are the mechanisms of resistance, and some of those, as we've heard, can also be passed from one bacterial species to another through plasmids, and that's the thing which is fairly unhelpful to our cause. So what's been described, and Dame Sally Davies, who was our Chief Medical Officer until she retired this year and took a very leading role in all of this, it's a major public health threat, and it's particularly a future public health threat. So the WHO have taken notice of that as well, and previous government commissioned Jim O'Neill to review antimicrobial resistance on behalf of the UK government, and his report, which is widely quoted on the future threat, both in terms of mortality and economic terms, was published in 2016, and we'll allude to that a little bit more. So this is how he described it, with the potential by 2050 for 10 million deaths worldwide from these multi-resistant bacterial infections, and which would eclipse the predicted deaths from cancer, and a GDP effect of wiping out $100 trillion of the cumulative GDP between now and that same date. In the US particularly, they've estimated, in addition to all that, an extra $20 billion in excess direct healthcare costs to actually try and manage these resistant infections if you haven't got bacteria that work. So both the WHO and the American CDC, the Center for Disease Control, have come up with the lists of the key pathogens as we understand them at the moment, with the top 3 being critically important and very, very serious, then high importance, and then medium importance. And in fact, anyone who's seriously interested, the CDC published an update last week, which is on their website, to their report from 2013, which admits that they underestimated the risk of mortality. So it's a problem that's with us, and it's a problem that's going to get worse unless we take serious action. And it's a global issue, so this is a case in point where a resistant strain of Klebsiella, which seems to have arisen in North Carolina, then turned up in New Delhi, and has been characterized in various parts of the world. And there are maps like this for various other specific strains. It is global. No one country is going to solve it, and we need action everywhere to make sure that we get it under control. So what's been going on, and what are the recent progress? We like to say that the UK is leading on this, and Dame Sally Davies, when she was Chief Medical Officer, in her annual medical report, the State of the Nation, she always reviews the whole landscape and then also focuses on a specific issue. And in 2012, she focused on antimicrobial resistance. That was followed by the UK having a 5-year national action plan, but it was also followed up through the WHO with their annual report and the report on AMR surveillance. And discussions at the very high level, again as you heard this morning, with heads of state across the world agreeing that it was something that ought to be addressed. And it's all very well having high-level people talking once a year or once every 2 years, but the WHO recognises that there needs to be a global approach, but a local action. So the guidance from WHO is that all countries need a national action plan, and there has been quite a lot of work in many countries along those lines. So right up to last year, there have been reports being published and work being done. As I said, the O'Neill report came out in 2016, which captures the analysis of the future threat, the increasing mortality and effect on GDP. And there were 2 reports at the beginning of last year which are about to be updated, so I'll come back to that before we finish here. But industry got involved with a declaration straight after the G20 Davos meeting at the beginning of 2016, and over 100 members of industry, including companies and trade associations around the world, signed up to take action on this. And that was followed up by a roadmap of a smaller proportion of those, but I'll touch on some of the things we've actually been doing as we go forward. So a lot of work's been done. As I said, the UK had a 5-year strategy from 2013-2018, which Diane mentioned. That was organised in a certain way and a lot of work was done, but this was refreshed last year. The 20-year vision, she mentioned 9 ambitions. These are the 3 high-level overarching visions, and the vision really looks across the world. It's not just UK. So lower burden of infection and better treatment, optimal use of antimicrobials and good stewardship, and new diagnostics, therapies, vaccines and interventions in use within 20 years. And an important point is with access. So we talk about appropriate prescribing. In certain parts of the world, you also need appropriate access. And some countries, some patients who need antibiotics in some part of the world still don't have access to all the medicines on the essential drugs list. So it's almost contradictory that we should be increasing access to some of these medicines at the same time as we're trying to control usage of them. But if you think about it carefully, it's not really contradictory. We need the right patients to get the right drugs at the right time. And if you aren't able to treat infections in some countries, then those pathogens will still be kicking around and can move around the world, as we've seen. So we need action everywhere. We need the right antibiotics to be available in all parts of the world. So in our 5-year National Action Plan for the UK that was refreshed in January this year, it focuses at the top level on 3 key ways of tackling AMR. So reducing the need for an unintentional exposure to antimicrobials. So that talks to really appropriate use. Use antibiotics when they're needed and don't use them when they're not needed. Optimizing the use and investing in innovation, supply and access. And within those 3 umbrellas, there are 15 working areas, specific plans in place, and I've just highlighted here those which industry is specifically directly involved with. So minimizing environmental impact, the AMR Industry Alliance published last year discharge limits from factories so that we make sure that levels of anything that comes out of the factories that make these things are low enough that they're not contributing to environmental development of resistance. Optimal use in humans, clearly supporting the right education on appropriate use and stewardship. You'll see probably next week quite a lot of activities that are going on as related to World Antibiotic Awareness Week. We support surveillance of the key pathogens around the world. At least 2 of our major members support the British Society of Antimicrobial Chemotherapy, the BSAC surveillance in the UK. And obviously basic research, development of new therapeutics, wider access, development of and access to diagnostics and to vaccines. We're working in all of those areas. Vaccines is an interesting area because prevention is always a good idea. The impact of the strep pneumo vaccines that came in a few years back has been definitely to reduce the incidence of streptococcal infections and reduce the proportion of primary care infections that are caused by streptococcus. So vaccines can play a serious part here. Indirectly, vaccines against flu will reduce the overall amount of infection in the population and reduce the opportunity for inappropriate prescribing. So if you don't get the flu, you don't go and ask for an antibiotic. So vaccines definitely have a part to play. As I mentioned earlier, better diagnostics would be great, and there's a whole branch of industry, not so much our members, but there are companies that are working specifically on diagnostics. And we've alluded to this already, so that it needs a One Health approach, it needs a global approach, it needs a One Health approach. So it's humans, animals, agriculture and the environment need to come together because wherever we're not addressing the issue, it remains a place where you can have a reservoir of resistant organisms. And I think it was pretty good to hear that the animal health and vets particularly are taking the same sort of approach as human health in terms of appropriate prescribing. I think they've reached the level where it's appropriate use, the right medicines for the right animals at the right time. So, an update to where we are right now. So as I said, the commercial reality by 1990, the diminishing return on investment with all these very good antibiotics that had now become generic was leading to a decline in investment in R&D. So around the end of the 80s, there were 18 major companies, large pharmaceutical companies, had been working and were committed to antibiotic research and development. And unfortunately, by 2013, that had dropped to 4, simply because they were moving their investment into oncology, immunotherapy, and various other more challenging areas, and areas of greater unmet need at the time. However, since all of that work from Sally Davies and the WHO and all the reports that have come out and the discussions at a high level, this has triggered quite a bit of activity since 2013. As I said, UK's had a leading voice in that in the global community, and AMR is a global issue. Many of our members are large global companies, and so they recognise as well that action needs to be taken across the world. So what has happened recently? Since 2010, these are pretty well the only antibiotics that have been registered. As was mentioned earlier today, I don't think any of these are from completely new classes. Some of them are very traditional classes and combinations. So the first combination of a penicillin with a beta-lactamase inhibitor to get around that mechanism of resistance was launched in 1981, and these two combinations, Zabaxa and Zavicefta, are similar approaches where the active cephalosporin has a specific target, but it is combined with a beta-lactamase inhibitor to ensure that that is still effective in those bugs that have resistance due to that mechanism. The specific one I want to draw your attention to would be Zemdry. So that was developed originally with research funding, which we'll mention a bit more later, and was launched by a small company. The final development and launch in the USA, plasmicin by Achargen, and unfortunately within 9 months of putting it on the market, Achargen filed for bankruptcy. So that is a very critical illustration of the need for something to be done about the market for these antibiotics if we do develop possible new ones in research. However, in spite of all that, there are a number in development at the moment. So we've touched on this. There was the Health and Social Care Select Committee inquiry, the 5-year refresh of our strategy, which we've talked about. The NHS has a 10-year action plan to help describe how it's going to use the increased investment that was put in, I think, a year ago, and that has some sections which address AMR specifically. We work as the representative of UK industry with other industry associations, the international industry, the European industry, the US PHRMA, and the Japanese Industry Association. And the 2 progress reports I mentioned, which I'll just touch on now, will be updated early in the new year, so look out for those. So the first is the report from that AMR Industry Alliance that I mentioned. And as of almost 2 years ago, industry is still investing a fair bit in AMR-related projects. Appropriate use is addressed with 80% of companies having activities in terms of supporting education on that front, and pretty well all of the companies in that alliance still support surveillance work around the world, because it's obviously very important wherever you are that you're making antibiotic choices on the basis of local and up-to-date susceptibility and resistance data. access, as I mentioned, supporting the WHO action plan to improve access to essential drugs in all countries, and manufacturing the environment I mentioned, and that it's that group that put together the discharge targets. What's next is to measure whether our factories and then our suppliers' factories are actually conforming to that all around the world. So that's going to be another challenge, but it's important that we address that. And the other report from the Access to Medicines Foundation is an independent report that again will be updated early next month. And they looked at overall, I think about 22 companies. 18 were assessed for research and development. So there are about 40 antimicrobials in development, but that's a pretty small proportion of that 7,000 I mentioned early on. Vaccines against 12 of the 19 priority pathogens are either in development or on the market, but there are some of these priority pathogens that are more difficult to work up a vaccine for, and even if you did find a vaccine to, say, Klebsiella or Pseudomonas aeruginosa, the next question is, who do you vaccinate? Because it's not going to be a childhood vaccination for everybody. The risk patients are those in hospitals who are elderly, immunocompromised, transplant, oncology, and so there's going to have to be a clear discussion about how you decide who to use those vaccines on. Not to say that we shouldn't be doing it. And more these projects to search for new approaches are being done in partnership. So the UK research councils, CARB-X, which is a more international collaboration, BARDA in the US, all of these funding mechanisms, Wellcome Trust and other charities, will fund research, but it tends to be the early stage research. So what we need to do as industry and in partnership is to take those potential new molecules through the system we talked about and actually deliver them as medicines to patients at the end of the process. And if there isn't that market attractiveness, the incentive to do that is not there at the moment, so that needs work. So in terms of specifically antibiotics, the challenges that we see are scientific, regulatory and economic. So scientific-wise, I mentioned we're addressing that with the investment from research councils and other funders, and there is an early pipeline. We should also be looking more broadly at novel approaches such as the one you saw from Nottingham and the phage approach, and I'll mention a couple more of those in a moment. The regulatory challenges really do then link to the economic ones, but the regulatory challenge is what data do you gather to show the regulatory authority that you have a safe and effective medicine. And the traditional way of doing a clinical trial, even a double-blind randomized controlled trial in a specific infection, say urinary tract infections, if we go out now and do a standard one of those, you won't get many resistant infections. And so you will have a study which shows that your new antibiotic is non-inferior to the existing generic antibiotics, probably, as in it's no better, therefore it's not worth any more. So the pricing that you're going to get is at the moment going to be no better than the generics. So that's really the fundamental as to why it's not an attractive area. What we need to do is to be able to explore the microbiology of the resistant pathogens that are going to be targeted. So we need to be able to show that the new antibiotic has some potential against one of the resistant pathogens. And we then need to be able to do enough further clinical work, maybe in specific small populations, maybe under an adaptive conditional pathway to regulatory approval, whereby approval is given to use the antibiotic in clinical practice and collect the more data that you need to show that it is effective against the resistant pathogens. So there's a big piece of work that needs to be done in that regulatory space. And finally, we've touched on the economic challenges. So the market's dominated by effective generics, as it is, as I've said, for a lot of therapy areas. The valuation needs to assess the contribution to preventing that future risk that O'Neill described. So it's not so much trying to treat the modest but serious number of infections we have in the UK now. It's about preventing the future risk that's been described by O'Neill and Sally Davies and other people. And we need some evidence, as I mentioned, to show that we might have efficacy over and above the traditional antibiotics against the resistant pathogens. We need to take account of that experience with Achargen and companies like that going into liquidation because there isn't enough money in this area. And the payment, we think, should be separated from the volume of usage. So if the government or governments incentivize us to bring a new antibiotic to the patients, then we put a very clear appropriate use plan around that and make sure it's used when it's needed, but only when it's needed. And I put at the bottom there incentives. There have been a whole host of discussions about how to fix this market challenge, and incentives are being applied at the push side, which is to fund research projects, which is having a degree of success. There's limited support for that translational piece in early clinical development. They've been playing around with accelerated approvals, but saving 6 months on regulated really doesn't solve the issue at the scale of the market failure that we talked about. There's a proposal for a transferable exclusivity extension so that if you brought a new antibiotic to market, you'd be able to transfer exclusivity of an extra year to a much higher selling product, which would therefore indirectly give you incentives, financial incentives to do that. And that transferability would enable a small company to sell that to a big company so they could use it on a valuable product on the assumption the small company hasn't got other products, so it wouldn't be of direct value to them. O'Neill talked about a market entry reward, but there's concern that one-off global payment is going to be very difficult to broker across various governments. And then in the UK, we've worked very hard with the Department of Health and Social Care on defining a novel reimbursement model which specifically agrees evaluation by NICE and negotiates an annual payment for the availability of something that is effective but completely separate from the volume of usage. There are some practical challenges with that, but there's a central project going on right now in NICE and NHS England to explore that as an approach. And we're very hopeful, we're confident that if that all follows through, that it would give us a way of doing things differently. So, looking ahead, what would you expect from industry? And I think most of these you would expect, and most of them we're involved in. So we need to discover new medicines, absolutely. It would be great to find new classes. We need to develop those and bring them right the way through the system to regulatory approval so they can be delivered to patients. We need to champion appropriate use and stewardship to prevent future development of resistance and support education as we are here to help make the most of what we've got. So there are a lot of antibiotics out there and many of them continue to be very effective against most infections, but those priority resistant ones, the multi-resistant pathogens that are really serious in hospitals, let's see if we can contain that and find things to treat those in the future. We need to support surveillance. We think there needs to be a broader surveillance in the UK. The first 5-year plan and the current one has mandated that we surveillance a number of those priority pathogens. I think we need to look at all of them. And in terms of mortality, Sally Davies has highlighted the fact that it's quite difficult to measure mortality because of what actually gets put on death certificates. So in many cases, patients die of cancer. They don't die of cancer, they die of pneumonia with a multi-resistant infection. sepsis patients die of resistant infections. If we can put the resistant pathogen on the death certificate, we'd be able to measure the impact of the infections more accurately than we do at the moment. And we need to investigate new and different approaches. So we mentioned vaccines, phage therapy, there are oligonucleotides, there's microbiome transplants, where you're looking at actually defining what's in the normal microbiome and replacing that in patients where their microbiome is seriously affected, which it sometimes is. And we need to address the commercial reality. And I think that would be a good place to stop and see if there are any questions. Thanks.